Life has a way of flipping on you when you least see it coming. One moment, I'm a happily married guy looking forward to becoming a dad. And the next, I'm neck deep in a mess of lies, betrayal, and chaos. What looked like a perfect life at first slowly unraveled into a nightmare, making me question everything I ever thought I knew about my wife, my marriage, and even myself. My wife and I have known each other for 6 years, and we've been married for 5. I'm 28, and she's 27. Right now, she's pregnant and taking a break from her job as a police officer to get ready for the baby. But things started going downhill when a couple of cops, real jerks, showed up at my door and tried to threaten me. We ended up in a huge fight that she started, and I finally threw her out of the house. One of these cops, her ex-partner, seemed to think that just because he wore a badge I should be intimidated. This guy used to be her partner back when she was still out on patrol, and they'd been working together for about a year. She's been with the department for 4 years, but ever since she partnered with him, she's been acting off, and our marriage has been falling apart. Things got heated during that argument, and it got to the point where she slapped me first, so I threw her out. Right after, she called her cop friend, and he came over, threatening to arrest me if I didn't back down. I'd had a hunch for a while that something was going on between them, and this incident only confirmed my suspicions. To give you some context, this all started back when my wife first considered becoming a cop. She'd just finished community college with a criminal justice degree, and I was between jobs. We were struggling financially, and the police department offered decent pay, so she took the job. It wasn't supposed to be a forever thing, though, since the risks involved were high. I remember one time she got seriously hurt during a call about a domestic dispute, and I had to visit her in the hospital. That day, she'd been called to a domestic situation between a woman and her drunk boyfriend. She went there alone because her partner was out sick, assuming it might be straightforward. She knocked, got no answer, but then heard a woman screaming inside. She called for backup and forced her way in. By the time she got inside, the drunk guy was attacking his girlfriend. She pulled out her taser to subdue him, but it only set him off more. He came at her before she could grab her firearm, and they fought. She barely held her ground until backup showed up. It was terrifying for both of us, a real brush with death. Seeing her in that hospital bed was one of the worst days of my life. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, and the doctor said she almost lost her eye. It was a reality check for both of us. I stayed by her side for 2 days, and it took her a while to recover physically and mentally, too. She was on paid leave for nearly a month. While she was recovering, we had a serious talk about her leaving the force and maybe trying for a TSA position. The pay wouldn't be as good, but it'd give me some peace of mind. Every time she stepped out in that uniform, I worried she wouldn't come back. Around then, I was wrapping up my mechanic training and taking on side jobs to help pay the bills. Once she felt ready, she returned to work but took on a desk job to ease back in. Her first week, she came home complaining about how boring it was and how she missed being out there. I reminded her about what happened when she went in alone without backup, trying to assure her she'd get used to the slower pace. My wife has this habit of spilling every detail about her day as soon as she gets home. I let her get it all out. After all, we can't afford a therapist, so I'm her sounding board. After about 6 months behind the desk, she started venting about this new guy at work, an ex-Marine who'd joined the force. She'd complain about how arrogant he was, acting like some kind of hotshot. She'd go on, saying she couldn't stand his cockiness and that she'd heard rumors about him mistreating detainees and crossing the line. I told her she should either report him or let it go. I honestly thought she was exaggerating. From what she said, it seemed like she was just jealous. She's never been one for arrogance. I remember how much she used to rant about Trump, even went to a women's march against him, and leaned more liberal because of it. I figured she saw this guy as a mini-Trump and was just venting her frustrations. This went on for a month. Then suddenly, she stopped mentioning him. At first, I felt relieved, but a few weeks later, she started bringing up the idea of returning to patrol work. I tried to talk her out of it, reminding her how light duty nearly landed her in the hospital last time. She let it go for a while, but the topic kept coming back up, with her insisting it'd be easy tasks only. Then she mentioned working extra shifts. While I understood she wanted to contribute, it seemed strange since we weren't in any financial strain. We were doing okay, and she'd always talked about wanting kids. I wanted kids too, but I wasn't in a rush. Eventually, I started suspecting that she was back on patrol without telling me. One night, she mentioned working overtime, so I decided to see for myself. I went down to the police station where she was supposed to be, but I couldn't access the office area without her seeing me. So I waited outside, hoping I'd catch her during a break or at the end of her shift. My patience wore thin, and I headed home before seeing anything. When she came back from work, I confronted her. She lied right to my face, saying she'd been in her office all evening, knowing full well that I had no way of verifying her story because they wouldn't let me into the office area. Determined to catch her in the act, I went so far as to buy a police radio scanner, like something straight out of a cop movie. I spent 2 days listening and recording her transmissions, and soon enough, I discovered her new patrol partner was none other than that arrogant guy she'd once compared to Trump. At this point, I wasn't necessarily thinking she was cheating on me. I was just more worried about her lying and putting herself in another dangerous situation. It was like she'd turned into her own version of G.I. Jane, chasing some fantasy of action straight from her favorite cop shows. To me, she just didn't seem cut out for patrol duty, and I couldn't figure out why the department even allowed it. That night, I confronted her. I pointed out that her supposed enemy, the one she called Donald Trump, was now her partner. She insisted it was out of her hands, that he was the only one available and she didn't have a choice. She even tried to paint it as a good thing, saying I should be glad someone brave enough to handle the job was there to keep her safe. I countered that she wouldn't need anyone protecting her if she'd stayed at her desk or quit the force altogether, but she just dismissed what I said. After catching her in this lie, she started opening up about how much she loved the job now, how she felt alive again, and started talking about becoming a detective someday. I was sure her new partner was the one feeding her all these ideas, as she started sounding more and more like him. I should have seen it as a red flag, but I trusted her and tried to ignore it. Over time, my wife started changing in ways that made her feel like a stranger to me. Her conversations were different, almost like she was someone else, and her tone with me had shifted. Her hours became unpredictable, and any quality time we had depended on when her partner felt like working overtime. She'd suddenly cancel our plans to go on patrol with him instead. I told her this wasn't the military and they weren't on some battlefield. She couldn't just drop everything for her partner's schedule. When I suggested they find him a new partner, her response drove me up the wall. She said she didn't want to let him down. That's when I began to suspect she might be having an affair. When I confronted her, asking if she could stop working with him because of how it made me feel, she shot back that I was being insecure. She assured me he was happily married with kids and would never cheat on his wife. But all I heard was her emphasizing his loyalty, which told me she'd at least thought about cheating with him. She brushed off my concerns by saying women at work were always after him, but he was loyal. He liked every single one of her photos on Facebook. Who does that, especially with a married woman? When I called her out on it, she just shrugged and said, "He's my partner." From that point, our marriage started to crack. I resented her refusal to stop working with this guy, and she didn't seem to care how much it hurt me. Even when I pressed her, she lied and said they weren't partners anymore. But when I checked around, people at her job confirmed they were still together on patrol. Eventually, she mentioned wanting a break from the force to focus on starting a family and said she was planning to stop her birth control. I didn't find it suspicious at the time. Maybe she'd seen how her partner had a family and wanted the same. Plus, I wanted kids too. About a month later, she was pregnant. A few months after that, I landed a great job as a field technician with a medical equipment company. The pay was too good to turn down, but it meant I'd have to travel 3 days a week. By then, she was around 3 or 4 months pregnant and had taken a break from work. I found it odd that she was home all day with little to do, but I didn't give it much thought. Then, after one of my 3-day business trips, I came home and got a strange tip from a neighbor. He's a decent guy. I'd helped out with some free car repairs before, so we were friendly. He told me he'd seen a police officer visiting our house 3 days in a row, hanging around for hours while I was gone. My wife wasn't supposed to be working, so there was no reason for a cop car to be parked in front of our place. When she came home, I confronted her about it. At first, she denied it all, but when I told her the neighbors had seen him, she changed her tune. She said she'd been lonely with me away and needed some company, claiming it was completely innocent. I argued she had plenty of friends she could have called. Why him? She got defensive, accusing me of being paranoid and insecure. I shot back that her sketchy behavior was the real problem here. Things escalated fast. She slapped me twice and went for a third, but I caught her hand just in time. She was 5 months pregnant, so I was careful not to hurt her, but I wasn't surprised by her aggression. She'd hit me a few times before, especially when she knew she was wrong or losing an argument. I held her, spun her around, lifted her up, and carried her to the door while she thrashed around, cussing and screaming. I knew the neighbors could hear, but I wasn't letting her stay in the house that night. I set her down gently outside and locked the door before she could get back in. She tried to force her way in but eventually gave up and went to the neighbors to borrow a phone. Instead of calling her family, friends, or even the police, she called that arrogant partner of hers. He showed up at my doorstep, acting like he owned the place, bringing another officer with him. They accused me of all kinds of things, but I had the marks from her attack and pictures to prove she was the aggressor. He looked ready to throw his weight around, probably hoping to clear the path for his affair with my wife. She'd already lied, claiming I started the fight, but had no evidence. Despite my proof, I still ended up in handcuffs, treated like a criminal in my own home, and was told to leave for the night. I spent the night at my neighbor's house, shaken and furious at what had happened. I'm planning to sue him. He even falsified the incident report. The next morning, I went back home. My wife seemed apologetic, saying sorry for everything, including hitting me and lying. But at that point, her words felt hollow. Despite the fact that her lies nearly destroyed me, I told her we needed to separate, at least until after the baby was born. She seemed worried about how she'd support herself until she could work again. So I suggested she lean on the friend she'd called that night to back her up. The next day, I moved out but agreed to cover half the lease since my name was still on it. I just couldn't live there, knowing she was probably involved with another man. She kept denying it, but to me, the truth was plain as day. 2 days after I left, she wouldn't stop calling, asking me to come back. I told her I was out of town for work and that it was best for us to stay separated until the baby arrived. I planned to swing by later to gather my things after wrapping up my field assignment. We kept in contact, and every time I brought up the affair, she'd deny it and get defensive, sometimes outright furious that I would even bring it up. I didn't have any hard evidence, just my gut feeling, and somehow, she managed to turn our family and friends against me, saying I was abandoning her and spreading lies. My own parents sided with her because they wanted to be grandparents. When I shared my suspicions and told them about how she had called her partner to kick me out, they refused to believe me. Her dad, who'd never liked me, even called to threaten me. I just hung up, knowing he'd always had it in for me. She got to our 3 mutual friends first, too, playing the victim, crying to them about how I was leaving her. They all believed her, dismissing my concerns, assuming there was no way she'd ever do something like that. I had already reached out to my lawyer about suing the police department for the illegal detainment and eviction. That cop even went as far as filing a false report against me. Over the next 2 weeks, we had countless phone conversations trying to work things out, but she kept twisting the story, somehow convincing everyone, even my parents, to side with her. With no solid proof of an affair, I began to doubt myself. My neighbor kept an eye on things for me and told me he hadn't seen any police car around, and that my wife rarely left the house except for groceries. I started wondering if maybe I'd been wrong. About a month after we separated, with my wife now 6 months pregnant, we reconciled, and I moved back in. For a while, it felt like old times, as if none of this mess had happened. She acted like she had nothing to hide, but with my work schedule, I couldn't be home all the time. Not wanting to depend entirely on my neighbor, I installed hidden cameras around the house, in the bedroom, living room, and driveway, hoping to catch anything suspicious while I was away. I was traveling more than ever at this point, sometimes for an entire week, and reviewed the footage carefully every time I got back. But for nearly a month, nothing came up. Her partner never showed, and her behavior seemed innocent. Eventually, I started to let it go, though a small part of me still doubted her. Fast forward to around 7.5 months into her pregnancy, and our rocky past felt like it was finally behind us. With her due date approaching, I decided to cut back on work travel to stay closer to her. But as we spent more time together, I noticed she was constantly on her phone, engrossed in texting. At first, I assumed it was just friends or family checking in, so I didn't think much of it. But over time, it started to eat at me. I couldn't enjoy our time together because her phone was always buzzing, and what really raised my suspicion was how she acted while texting. She'd smile or chuckle quietly, then quickly hide the screen if I glanced over. I didn't want to believe she'd be sneaking around, especially being so far along in her pregnancy. But one evening, while we were watching TV, she got a text and immediately walked into the bathroom. It was obvious she didn't want me to see. I turned down the TV, got up, and stood near the bathroom door, trying to hear what she was up to. All I heard was her tapping away on her phone, but it was enough to make me suspicious. My wife used an iPhone with fingerprint verification, and we never shared passwords, so I waited until she fell asleep one night. Once she was out, I carefully used her finger to unlock the phone and snuck off to the bathroom to check her messages. The last person she'd texted was someone named Melanie. The only message visible from Melanie was "Sweet Dreams," which seemed innocent enough, but here's the thing. My wife had been in the bathroom texting for a solid 30 minutes, and the last message before Melanie's was from 3 hours prior. She'd clearly deleted the other messages to cover something up. My stomach dropped, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding more than she'd admit. I copied Melanie's number and slipped back into bed, though I barely slept that night. The next day, on my lunch break, I went to a payphone and dialed the number. I had a hunch it belonged to her patrol partner. Pretending to be from the utility company, I mentioned his name, and he confirmed his identity with a simple, "This is me." All my suspicions came flooding back, and I realized I hadn't been imagining things. Still, I was too exhausted and emotionally drained to confront her right away. Considering her due date was close, I decided to wait until after the baby was born before making any major decisions. Every time I looked at her, especially with her belly showing, I felt torn. I wanted nothing more than to believe we could still have a real family. I couldn't understand why she kept lying, why she chose to put me through so much pain instead of just being honest. I'd been visibly anxious and depressed, especially with the baby on the way, and the constant doubt gnawed at me. A few months later, she gave birth to a baby boy. I never thought for a second that he might not be mine. To me, he looked more like her, but at that age, it's hard to tell. A few days after she was discharged from the hospital, I finally confronted her about the texts. I brought up the number, telling her I'd called it and her patrol partner had answered. She tried to brush it off, claiming it was just a female friend, but I wasn't buying it. She kept denying everything, so I suggested we open her messages and call the number on speakerphone. The way she flat out refused was the last straw. I told her I'd had enough, and I was moving out again. That's when she broke down and admitted the number belonged to her coworker. She claimed she'd hidden his contact because he'd been texting her nonstop, and she didn't want to seem rude by ignoring him. She knew I'd be angry if I found out, so she put his number under a fake name. I insisted she quit her job and find a different one, and she agreed. I also told her to block his number and cut him off, which she did right in front of me. I wasn't naive, though. I knew she could unblock him anytime and keep it going in secret, but it felt like she was trying to make things right, and part of me wanted to believe her. Things seemed to settle down after that. Our families came by to celebrate the baby's arrival, and for a while, it felt like we were on the road to fixing things. We even started house hunting since we were still renting. To save up for a down payment, I took on more travel assignments, which meant being away from home more often. With a newborn and my wife now unemployed, expenses were tight, but I was thrilled to be a dad, and she wanted to stay home with the baby instead of using daycare, which I preferred, at least for now. But a few months later, while I was on a field assignment, I started noticing something off. There were times I'd call, and she wouldn't answer or return my calls, even in the evenings when she should have been home. It didn't make sense since she wasn't working, and her main responsibility was to look after our baby. When I talked to my neighbor, he mentioned he'd noticed my wife often spent nights away from home when I was gone. That only added to my suspicions, and I realized she'd never confess unless I had solid proof. The next week, after getting back from a trip, I took matters into my own hands. I bought a GPS tracker and secretly installed it in her car. I needed to find out where she was going with our child when I wasn't around and why she was avoiding my calls. I talked to my boss and arranged to stay local for the rest of the month so I could keep a close eye on things. To avoid suspicion, I told my wife I'd be traveling out of state for work, giving me the chance to follow her undetected. Sure enough, that evening, she drove to an unfamiliar apartment complex with a gated entrance. I parked nearby and waited for a car to open the gate so I could slip in behind her. After I parked a few spaces away, I watched as she went inside one of the units. Not knowing which one, I stayed put, deciding to test her honesty. I called her and asked where she was. She didn't pick up, but about 30 minutes later, she called me back, claiming she'd been busy with the baby. I casually asked if she was at home, and she insisted she was. I told her my work had finished early and I'd be home within an hour. She stumbled over her words, caught off guard, and said she needed to tidy up before I got back. Right then, I knew she was lying. She quickly hung up, promising to call once I'd landed. 10 minutes later, I saw her coming out of the apartment with the baby swing in one hand and the baby bag in the other. But what hit me the hardest was seeing her patrol partner right there, carrying my child like he was the father. It was obvious she hadn't cut ties with him. My suspicions about paternity grew right then. I couldn't hold it in any longer and walked up to them, confronting them both. They were both stunned. I told her there was no need for her to come home. I'd seen enough. She offered no apology. They just left as fast as they could. I immediately called her father, explaining what had happened. I told him his daughter had been unfaithful and that I doubted the baby was even mine. I admitted I'd lost my cool, but after years of being lied to and manipulated, I didn't hold back. When I went back to the house, she was already gone, as I expected. The next day, she called me in tears, insisting she hadn't done anything wrong and needed to pick up some things for the baby, like food and clothes. I told her she could come by, but I wouldn't be there. I was questioning the baby's paternity and was moving forward with a divorce. She insisted the baby was mine, saying I'd regret doubting it. I told her the only way to know was through a DNA test, and I reminded her that she hadn't really cut ties with her partner, making it impossible for me to trust her. She showed up with a female friend, likely to avoid escalating things, but I didn't speak to her because I was too hurt. That same day, I ordered a DNA test kit and had it delivered overnight. I avoided speaking to her, as I couldn't handle the thought of all I'd done for this child and the possibility that he wasn't even mine. When the kit arrived, I had a hard time finding a moment to get a swab, since she was always close by with the baby. Her friend eventually left, realizing I wasn't going to cause a scene. 3 days later, I managed to ask her if I could hold the baby one last time. It was a tough moment because I truly cared for the child, and I desperately wanted him to be mine. I was clinging to hope that the DNA results would confirm it. Finally, I got the sample and sent it in without her knowledge. A few days later, while I was across town for work, the results arrived. I logged in to view them, and my heart sank. The baby wasn't mine. I shared the results with my parents, wanting them to see that they'd been wrong to doubt me. But in the back of my mind, I still wished the results were different. I sent them to her father as well, so he'd see the truth of what his daughter had done. I didn't give the results to her directly. By now, I knew she suspected the truth. Since we didn't have any shared property, the divorce process would be straightforward. Legally, since I was married to my ex-wife when the baby was born, I was presumed to be the father. This meant I had to go through the courts to officially end the legal parent-child relationship, free myself from any support obligations, and finalize the divorce. I contacted a divorce attorney to get the process moving as quickly as possible. It's now been 14 months since I divorced my unfaithful wife, and a lot has changed. I decided to leave the city I grew up in because I kept facing harassment from the police. I filed complaints twice and took legal action twice, winning one case, but the harassment never stopped. Eventually, I made the choice to get out. I travel often for work and wanted to live somewhere in the countryside where I could enjoy hunting and camping. So I bought several acres of land as a place to escape and unwind. When my ex was served the divorce papers while I was out of town, it turned into a chaotic mess. She kept calling, but I ignored her. 2 days later, I returned with a U-Haul to pack up my things. She was there and tried to stop me from leaving, but I took only what belonged to me, leaving behind anything we'd shared. She had to accept that I was truly done with our marriage, especially now that everyone had seen the DNA test results. All her lies were out in the open, and she couldn't manipulate our friends any longer. Before I left, I asked if I could hold the baby one last time. She agreed, and as I held him, I wished with all my heart that he was mine. My ex-wife started crying, apologizing for everything, but I quickly handed the baby back, feeling my own emotions about to spill over. I didn't want to break down in front of her. After that, I moved in with my parents to save up until I found a place I liked. Eventually, I relocated to a secluded spot in the countryside, where I bought a large piece of land with a small lake, perfect for hunting and camping on my own property. When I'm not traveling, I find peace here in this quiet, private retreat I can finally call my own. Even though I'm moving forward, I can't help but feel that I'm not the only one suffering. My ex-wife, the innocent baby, and I are all caught in this mess, while her affair partner seems to have walked away unscathed. I don't know for sure if he's the father, but all signs point in his direction. He and my ex had been working together for over a year, and I even caught him at my house, clearly there for her. They had exposed themselves, and he even went as far as renting an apartment to meet up with her. I gathered all the evidence, including the DNA test results, to confront him. I wanted to reach out to his wife, to let her know the truth about her husband. Using a paid service, I located his home address and confirmed who his wife was. When I had the address, I waited until he left for work and his wife was home, and then I delivered a package containing all the evidence. One night, as I was leaving a friend's house, I was pulled over by a cop. I hadn't been speeding or breaking any laws, so I was curious as to why I was stopped. At first, I thought it might be my ex-wife's affair partner, but it turned out to be an officer I'd never seen before. It felt suspicious, especially since I hadn't had any encounters with the police in years. He claimed I was speeding, which I knew I wasn't, but I took the ticket to avoid the headache of disputing it in court. Then, only a week later, I got another ticket, supposedly for speeding again, even though I was sure I was within the limit. Felt less like enforcement and more like harassment. This time, the officer asked for my license and registration, then started asking ridiculous questions about warrants and if the car was stolen. Frustrated, I called their questions absurd, which only made them angrier. They ordered me out of the car, but I refused, asking to speak to a supervisor and insisting I hadn't done anything wrong. They called for backup and forcibly pulled me out, handcuffing me. I ended up with cuts on my hands, a split lip, and back pain. My parents bailed me out the next day, and they saw what was going on, encouraging me to file a complaint against the officers involved. It became clear to me that my ex-wife's partner was likely behind this harassment. My parents were concerned for my safety and advised me to move away from the area. I realized they were right and decided to move to the countryside for a fresh start, away from the police force that seemed to be targeting me. I was fortunate they hadn't gone further. Had they planted anything in my car, my life could have taken an even worse turn. I filed a lawsuit against my ex-wife's partner for filing a false police report and also sued the arresting officers for unlawful arrest and false imprisonment. Winning a civil case requires strong evidence, so I built my case around the affair, the false report, and the DNA results. I won a settlement against her partner, but the false imprisonment case got dismissed. I planned to appeal. I also filed a complaint against her partner with the police department, using the civil judgment, which led to disciplinary action against him that will stay on his record. Word got back to me that my ex-wife's affair partner's wife finally left him. I imagine she uncovered his lies and decided she couldn't stay. Maybe that's why he's been so vindictive. I haven't spoken to my ex-wife, but mutual friends told me she's back working as a police officer and is now living with her affair partner in the very apartment where I caught them. Lately, I've started dating again, mostly through online platforms, setting up dates around my travel schedule. I've met some nice women, and a few seem like potential partners, but honestly, I'm hesitant about the idea of marriage again. After years of being lied to and deceived, I can't help but feel like I lost a big part of my life. I still find myself wondering what drives people to betray the ones they love, and if we can ever really know another person.